I'll switch to English again because I think I know, Johan, that you prefer lecturing in English. And so a very warm welcome to you and your lecture around disinformation. And I think you will be a little bit critical on how things are being done at the moment. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Ja, tack så mycket. Jag kan börja på lite skandinavisk. Det är inte så att jag inte fattar svenska alls, så klart också efter om ni har några frågor så kan jag också ställa dem på svenska och så kan jag liksom svara på skandinavisk eller engelska. Men ja, min föreläsning kommer jag göra på engelska. Också den bok som mycket är baserad på, som jag har skrivit, den är också på engelska. Så det är liksom det språk jag normalt jobbar med. Men jamen, tusind tak fordi at jeg kan være her i dag hjemmefra København. Jeg vil dele mine slides med jer. And then I will switch to English. So the title I've given for my presentation today is Disguised Propaganda, Fake News and Democracy. And this talk will be about my research, obviously, and it will be quite broad in a sense in terms of encompassing many different areas of my research. Because overall, you could say I'm very interested in disinformation from two different angles. First of all, I'm very interested in disinformation on social media, which I've been studying for the past years, so doing studies of disinformation campaigns. And on the other hand, I've also been very interested in studying discourses around post-truth and fake news, and how these kind of ways of thinking about fake news also shape politics in a sense. And as you said in your introduction, I have been critical with colleagues towards some of the current solutions we are seeing around the world to the problem of disinformation. So I will kind of do two parts of this talk, where in the first part, I want to dive into my empirical research on social media disinformation. I will be talking about how new forms of what we call disguised political propaganda has been arising, how race and racism often plays a key role in contemporary forms of disguised propaganda. And then finally, in this first part, I will then also complicate this notion of fake news and the idea that this is mainly a problem that we can tackle by teaching people how to spot it. Because often we can spot it if it's not well made, but as I will show, if this kind of disinformation is well made, it's not easy to spot at all. So it requires much more systemic solutions. And then in the second part of the talk, I will be outlining the key points from this book that I published with my colleague Yannick Skov. Is published by Routledge last year, which is called Post-Truth, Fake News and Democracy, where we dive into these discourses around post-truth and fake news and kind of try to put these into historical perspective and also be critical towards this idea of post-truth. So yeah, this is quite a bit. I hope I won't take too long, and I hope it won't be too much, but I'm really looking forward to diving into this with you guys. For the past 5 years now, this has really been what I've been spending most of my time thinking about. So I'm really happy to share it today. So let's dive into it. Disguised propaganda on social media. In this first part of my talk, I want to outline two cases from my own research, what I've been studying for these past years. The first is a Danish case. I'm from Denmark, as you probably realized already from my Swedish accent or attempt of a Swedish accent. The first half is about this Danish case, which kind of sparked my interest in the whole topic. It's a study of fake Muslim Facebook pages in Denmark. And then I will talk a little bit about a study I did with a colleague in London at the City University London about the Internet Research Agency, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of course, this Russian propaganda agency that infiltrated US political debates on social media. So the first case, which I put a note here at the bottom, if you want to read more, this has been published in the journal New Media and Society, and also another study on the same case in critical discourse studies. So this is a study we did of fake Muslim Facebook pages in Denmark, which existed in 2015. So quite some years ago already. I mean, this is kind of the reason I think this is still a very relevant case is that many of these tactics that we saw already in 2015 have really been perfected since. So many of them are the same that we then later see being deployed on a much more systematic, large scale by propaganda agencies such as the Russian IRA. But so this is a quote from one of these fake pages. I won't read it because it's a bit, it's a bit vulgar. But what this page is writing, it's a fake page which was created claiming to represent Muslims in Denmark, writing in Danish that we are Muslims and we're going to take over Denmark, and this is happening before your very eyes. We will rape your women, and this kind of discourse. So for those of you who might be familiar with like far-right conspiracy theories, this is quite familiar rhetoric, perhaps, because this is very much what we see in right-wing conspiracy theories, this idea, what has been called the Eurabia conspiracy theory, the idea that Muslims have this kind of organized plan to come to Europe and transform Europe to a caliphate, right? And rape women and all these kind of classic racist, xenophobic tropes. So these pages claim to be proof of this kind of conspiracy theory, right? So this is another post from one of these accounts, and as you can see, it got 95,000 views on Facebook. I don't know if you can see it; it's quite in small print, but this is a video where a person we can't see is peeing on a Danish flag in a toilet bowl, and then writing, "Muslims are pissing on your flag." So we did a study where we followed a number of these pages over a period of time. They kept coming and then being taken down by Facebook, and then a new one would come, taken down by Facebook. And it was quite some detective work to kind of find these pages before they were shut down and so forth. But what we found was this pattern that every time a page was taken down, the people behind would create a new one. They often only existed for a few days, but within that time, some of them managed to get thousands of comments. So in total, these pages got more than 20,000 comments from Danes. And unfortunately, what we find is that many of these, or most of these comments, believe in it, seem to believe in it, and respond with aggressiveness the other way, and often racism and xenophobia. So these pages became very kind of hostile places of racism and hatred. So these are some of the reactions where we can see the similar kind of hostility the other way, right? This kind of xenophobic racism and the belief that this is in fact a genuine identity, right? So that was of course a kind of a disheartening case to be studying in a sense, because we really found that again and again, even though these pages were taken down by Facebook, their strategy still kind of worked, because they could just keep creating new ones and people kept sharing them and kept believing in them. We even had a member of the Danish parliament writing, "Why don't you just leave Denmark if everything is so terrible?" sharing one of these fake pages. And I mean, when you enter these pages, there was nothing that immediately revealed that this was fake, right? The way we were able to establish that this was fake was through the pattern, right? We could see the same names being reused and the same names being slightly changed. We could, in some cases, find profile pictures taken from other places. But I mean, it is hard on such a Facebook page to just immediately see it. But of course, it was, again, sad to see that even a member of parliament would fall for this kind of hoax. So this is how one of the pages looked. I've blurred the face because this is, I don't know where this profile picture came from, likely taken from an individual Facebook page somewhere else online. And the top post says, like this if you want me to leave the country, and you can see that 1,500 people have liked, right? And this is a page that at this point has only existed for 1 or 2 days. So very fast they were able to attract this attention in Denmark. And what we find when we then kind of map these discourses is not surprising that, in a sense, that what the comment sections are doing is that they reproduce this hostility towards Muslims and this idea that Muslims are dangerous and are going to rape people and have a conspiracy. But of course, they also then display aggressiveness the other way, saying, yeah, but Danes, we are strong and we will fight you, and this kind of rhetoric. And so how is this happening, or why is this happening? That's the key question, right? And I mean, this thing about imitating someone else that you're trying to hurt, that is a very common old propaganda tactic. I mean, a very famous pamphlet or book from the early 20th century is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this Russian pamphlet claiming to be written by Jews who are writing that they're going to take over the world. And Hitler even referenced it in Mein Kampf. So, I mean, there's a long history of imitating certain religious or ethnic groups and claiming to be part of a conspiracy in order to vilify a group. But what is happening here, of course, is that Facebook is contributing to the way this is taking place. So what is, of course, happening is that page owners, they can see things that normal users can't, right? So one thing we found in our study is that these page owners, they would consistently delete comments from people saying, this is fake. So if you wrote, this is fake, they would remove that comment, and what would be left are all these hundreds of comments from people seemingly at least believing this, right? And of course, there is this hierarchy because these page owners can remain anonymous. It's impossible for me as a researcher or you as a user to see who is behind this Facebook page, right? Only Facebook has that kind of knowledge. And Facebook, the only thing they do about it is to remove a page if you report it and they find the report credible, right? So the hierarchy of Facebook plays a key role. We have on the one side a technological context, which is about anonymity for these people, and there's this power asymmetry, and of course the dissemination of this content, because that's key, right? That even if you write in a comment, this is fake, or that you share it in order to tell your friends, look at this fake profile, you have just still contributed to its proliferation, right? A comment is a comment, a like is a like, and Facebook's algorithms will use that to evaluate this content as being highly engaging. And of course, we also have to take the political context into consideration, right? This was 2015, there was the refugee crisis, and we had a national election in Denmark. And of course, there has been this rise in Islamophobia and nationalist populism in Denmark, as well as in many other European countries. So in order to understand this kind of case, we need to understand both. And we can't just say this is a Facebook problem, but we certainly can't just say that this would happen anyway, because the anonymity and these issues are all given by the technology. We then also did a study on the side of this Facebook group of activists trying to stop this from going on. It was called Stop Fake Hate Profiles on Facebook. And they had a couple of thousand members where they tried to find this kind of page and then report it to Facebook and write comments on the pages saying to others, this is fake, don't believe it. Of course, as I said, those would get removed by the page admins. And so we kind of followed for 6 months this group's efforts to try to combat this. And was it then viable is a key question, right? Because does this kind of user action work? And sadly, there were so many things that were difficult in all of this. And Facebook's way of dealing with this is not helpful always. Because what Facebook does is that the platform deletes a page or an account if they deem it to violate community standards, right? But of course, that means that these people behind, they don't face any real consequences. They get their page removed and then they can create a new one, right? And they can remain completely anonymous. And when it then comes to trying to alert authorities, because in this case, they were threatening with killings and that kind of thing, right? Serious things. The Danish authorities at that time, at least, did not follow up on this case. And in a sense, I think Facebook's strategy makes it harder sometimes to get authorities' attention, because you're basically saying you should look into this thing that existed for 2 days, now it's gone, but it was really bad and we need the police or some other authority to look into it, right? And so that didn't happen. So even though they were really engaged and tried to do a lot, it's still, at the end of the day, these people behind these pages, we never found out who they were. I mean, we never found out who actually did this, and it didn't have any consequences other than their pages being taken down. So that was the first case, and I will jump right into the next one, because as I said, I have quite a bit I want to talk to you guys about. And I hope you can, and I mean, you're very welcome to ask questions to these specific cases at the end. There should be a bit of time at the end. But this second case is then kind of 2.0 of what I just talked about, or the large scale version of that, right? Because this case in Denmark, I mean, it was likely just a few individuals who were behind this. That was my feeling. This is not a big professional operation. It was likely some political activists of some kind in Denmark doing this in order to try to provoke people. But this case, of course, as you are all familiar with, is a much more serious and large-scale version of that, namely the Internet Research Agency, this Russian propaganda agency, which over a number of years infiltrated political debates in the US, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. And I published a study with my colleague Marco Bastas in Social Media and Society, which is what this part of the talk is based on, if you want to read more afterwards. So what we did was that we wanted to find out more about, of course, what the Internet Research Agency have been doing, how they infiltrated political debates. So we queried this big historical database of tweets, mainly focused on the US, but also the Brexit referendum. And then we did this manual coding, meaning that we went through all the tweets manually, and for each of them, coded them on what topics they were about, who do they mention, and these kinds of things. And we did that with more than 6,000 tweets. And I won't go into the methods here, you can read that in the paper, but I just want to go into the findings and just a few of the prominent ones. So we find that the IRA, as I'm sure, again, if you're familiar with the case, already have read in other papers or in news reports, that they target these specific groups, and when they target these specific groups, they tailor accounts for that group, and they do it quite sophisticated. So some main groups they were targeting were Trump supporters, or conservative patriots, as we call them in our paper, because this dates back way before Trump even announced his candidacy. And then we have Black Lives Matter activists, and then we have, which was surprising to us, a lot of local news outlets. So outlets, Twitter accounts claiming to be local news in the US and only tweeting local news, which I will get into. So I just want to get into the Black Lives Matter ones and the local news. This is an example of one of these Black Lives Matter accounts that were run by the Internet Research Agency. You can see it had 24,000 followers, so quite a considerable amount, and it kind of uses all the right hashtags and all the right words, and were quite successfully able to infiltrate Black Lives Matter movement. And what we find generally about these accounts, and other scholars have found this as well, is that they follow a similar pattern. They claim to be Black US activists, they claim to be located in the US, and they only write in English, they write about Black Lives Matter issues, use all these hashtags associated with the movement, and are very, again, sophisticated in using retweets from actual public intellectuals and celebrities in the US. And what we then find is that they are very anti-Trump, these accounts. But the closer we get to the 2016 election, the more they also become anti-Hillary, saying Black people in the US shouldn't go out and vote. It doesn't matter. They are all the same. So just stay at home, basically, right? So what this indicates, of course, is that the IRA tried to get Black voters in the US, African-American voters, to stay at home and not vote. Because, of course, in recent history, Black people in the US have predominantly voted for the Democratic Party. So this was a way of engaging in voter suppression. If you encountered one of these pages or one of these accounts, even if I did as a researcher, there would have been nothing on this account that would have revealed that this was actually a Russian agent, a Russian operative. So it's not that this account shares a lot of fake news. It's not that this account is badly made. I mean, it really mimics a Black Lives Matter activist, and it even when it writes "Don't vote for Hillary," often these accounts even did it in a very sophisticated way that they didn't write it themselves. They found actual Americans, Black Americans, African Americans. It could be rappers or sports figures who actually wrote that, who wrote, "I'm not going to vote, it's all the same." And I mean, which is a very legitimate opinion to have, right? It's not fake news. But what is being done here, of course, is to boost these opinions and make sure they reach a lot of people, perhaps more people, likely more people than would have encountered that message otherwise. And that leads me to the second kind of, and to us, the most surprising group of accounts we find, which are these local news accounts. This is one of them, Chicago Daily News, which also had a lot of followers, as you can see. And when we found those, we were thinking, okay, what they must be doing is that they are disseminating real news, local news, but when we get close to the election, they probably switch over to fake news, right? They probably start disseminating something fake, some disinformation. But that's actually not what we find. We find that they just keep disseminating local news the whole way through. But what is interesting is that it's a very curated version of local news. They have a strong emphasis on accidents, killings, natural disasters. So if it's about weather, it's typically about a hurricane, right? I mean, so these accounts likely were created in order to give Americans a sense of fear that the world is a horrible place, a much more threatening place than what it actually is. So they only tweet local news, but they do so in a curated version. And they only tweet, I mean, so LA Online Daily, as I write here, they only tweet Los Angeles Times. So there is this kind of one-to-one where a local news account tweets local news from that area. But again, it's this strong preference for crime stories, disease, accidents, natural disasters, and a strong preference for headlines where someone is dying in the headline. So that's the hypothesis, right? That these were all created in order to just stoke fear on, which is again an old propaganda tactic, which goes back way before social media. So these accounts from the IRA did not primarily disseminate fake news or false information. They infiltrate certain target groups and then they amplify certain worldviews and certain ideas in order to achieve political goals. And this complicates the whole narrative about fake news being the main problem, because if you ask me, I mean, this kind of thing, one country attacking another country via social media, that is a key concern in the 21st century. But again, it's not primarily done through fake news, at least not on all these fake accounts that we are studying. And it kind of complicates this, again, prominent narrative that we should all learn to spot fake accounts, because there wasn't much to spot here. This is just one example, right, from the New York Times saying, can you spot the deceptive headline? And here, after doing these studies, I would say no. I mean, of course, if fake news is poorly made, then yeah, you can spot it. But the real threat is that this is becoming more sophisticated, which makes it harder to spot. So I think this focus on spotting it is a bit misleading and at least a bit unsatisfactory, because it's not going to really address the root of the problem. So the conclusion is that social media, I mean, this is the conclusion from the first part, right? Now we go into the second part. So that social media platforms, they enable these new forms of disguised political propaganda. And I like the word propaganda, by the way, because I think it's important to stress that this is not new in itself. This is an iteration of an old tactic of spreading propaganda. We saw it in the Cold War, we saw it in the Second World War, where also fake radio stations were set up and these kind of things. So I like the historical continuity of the term propaganda, just to if you're curious about that. But what is new, of course, is that these platform architectures play a key role in shaping this. And it makes it very hard to discern who is behind. It makes it very hard to discern whether this comes from an individual trying to provoke, or this comes from an organized campaign. And again, false content of fake news is not always the main problem. There's some attendee asked, how did you connect the IRA to the fake accounts? That's a really good question. I left that out here. So these are all accounts that were identified by Twitter, and the whole data set was shared with researchers after there was immense political pressure in the US to do so. So the US Congress kind of demanded that Twitter and Facebook found out how many accounts were linked to the IRA. And they compiled this list that was, yeah, I mean, it eventually became 3,800 something Twitter accounts. So this is the data we are drawing on. But yeah, as I said, the full paper is published in Social Media Plus Society, and it's actually open access. So even if you're not at a university library, you can access it. Yeah, so that was part one. I will take a sip of water and then we'll dive into part two. So in parallel with all of this, in parallel with my studies of social media disinformation, people started asking me a lot, do you study fake news, right? Do you study post-truth? Do you think we live in a post-truth era? And I became very interested in that, and I wasn't able to give a good answer at first. So I did what any researcher will do, is to start studying what is post-truth and what is this whole narrative that is circulating, and also try to ask some critical questions. And in the end, that became this book, which is the first one I've written with my colleague Yannick Skov, came out last year. And I also had the pleasure of traveling around in the US and presenting it. And in this book, we try to map out what has become this prominent narrative of post-truth and what are the consequences, not least. I mean, how is this narrative of a post-truth era shaping politics? What kind of solutions are we seeing to disinformation? And also, what are the consequences? Because I think, unfortunately, many of the ways that we are currently addressing disinformation is not sufficient. And some of them, actually, a lot of them actually even makes it worse, as I will get into. So I've been thinking a lot about this question of, do we live in a post-truth era? And in this second part of the talk, you will get my explanation for why I do not think we live in a post-truth era. And I think there are some key problems with saying that we do. So let's dive into it. I want to start head on with a quote from French President Emmanuel Macron, which you might all be familiar with, might even have heard it during these days, because it has kind of become the quote that captures a lot of this political imaginaries, these political imaginaries around fake news and post-truth. So in 2018, Macron visited the US and he gave this speech about fake news, about post-truth. And I will just read a little bit from this speech. He said, "To protect our democracies, we have to fight against the ever-growing virus of fake news, which exposes our people to irrational fear and imaginary risk. Without reason, without truth, there is no democracy, because democracy is about true choices and rational decisions. The corruption of information is an attempt to corrode the very spirit of our democracies." So what Macron is saying here is kind of the condensed version of what we find in a lot of post-truth narratives, that democracy is facing a crisis, a very severe crisis, which has been very sudden, and we need to do something radical now in order for democracy to survive, because democracy is truth, and truth is democracy in a sense. And therefore, we have to fight this virus. And the notion of virus is also important here. That's something we find across these post-truth discourses. Fake news is killing people's minds, as CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, said in 2017. When we dive into all that has been written about post-truth and fake news, we often find this idea of a grave, sudden threat, which takes the form of a virus or a disease, something that has, of course, only become more prominent now in these COVID-19 times, as I will also get into. But already before COVID, this idea, this metaphor of fake news being a virus has really been key in shaping a lot of thinking on this. Fake news is spreading and replicating like a virus, and so we have to track fake news pathogens. We have to develop a vaccine or a cure, but this has proven to be really hard because, again, this is not just something usual. This is a brand new strain of a disease, and it has proven alarmingly resistant to treatment, as this narrative goes. And the reason for this is that what has changed is not just that there is more false information out there, this narrative goes, is that people are changing. People have become trapped in filter bubbles or echo chambers and can't be trusted in the same way as they used to, right? And can't access truth in the same way. So this is why we need these radical measures in order to save democracy. So in our book, we address this big question of, is this really the state and future of democracy? Is this idea of a post-truth era really the best way to try to capture the current state of democracy? And is it really true in a sense that if we save truth by radical means or by any means necessary, we will have a better democracy? What are the solutions that are presented to save democracy right now? These are the kind of questions we dive into. And the way we do so is that we compile this archive of around 500 publications, including academic and non-academic books, news pieces, mainly from the US and UK, and some political speeches and so forth. And I mean, as all of you know, there's been written thousands upon thousands of news articles on fake news, right? So this is in no way kind of the definitive account. But what we wanted to do is kind of map some of these key publications that have come out and say, what are the common narratives in all of this? What is the common thread alongside all of these, and what are the solutions being presented here? And again, how can we raise some critical questions about whether this really is a good description? And the reason we think these post-truth discourses matter, I think that's first of all important to kind of point out. I think these discourses are really important because they shape not only our understanding of society right now, but also our idea about where we should be heading. What kind of political solutions should we be developing, right? So they are not just descriptions of the world, they are these normative visions of where we should be going. And this is why I think they're so important to really dive into and also be critical towards because they have material consequences. They are not just words and texts. I mean, right now we are seeing laws being implemented across the world to stop fake news, and we are seeing task forces, we are seeing tech solutions being developed, right? And I will of course get into all of that in this part of the talk. But so this is just to say, when we talk about discourses, we don't just talk about text or language, we really talk about kind of the normative visions and the consequences as well. And so in our book, we asked this question: how is democracy imagined to be in a crisis? What is blamed for this crisis? And what are then presented as the solutions? And then we also try to, as I said, put that into both historically and political theoretically. And just a disclaimer then, unlike what some might think when they read the title of our book, Post-Truth, Fake News and Democracy, our aim is actually not to try to map how much fake news is out there, or how big a threat is fake news online, or how do we best define it. As you can see from the first part of my talk, I am really interested in studying disinformation, but I don't think these are the most interesting questions for me around fake news. What I want to study, what we are studying, is how is this defined, and how is it fought over, this notion of fake news? How is the idea of this threat shaping politics? What are the consequences? So let's dive further into it. I mean, I've already touched upon the key aspects of post-truth discourses, right? Through this Macron quote and so forth. But I mean, if we look at the term, it was popularized before 2016 in a book called The Post-Truth Era. But I mean, as you all know, it really exploded into public debate with the election of Trump in 2016 and Brexit. You can see that on Google, for example, where you can just see on Google Trends that search queries for post-truth and fake news just really went through the roof, right? And we had post-truth becoming word of the year by Oxford Dictionary. And I mean, when we dive into, again, these discourses, it's not that we find that everyone agree about what fake news is and what post-truth is, because especially fake news, as you are probably also familiar with, is one of the most contested terms, right? But what is shared across all of these discourses, or most of these discourses, is this idea of a sudden crisis, that this crisis is caused by a demise of truth, that democracy is about truth, first and foremost, that we need something radical to solve it, something that has not been tried before, and we find these kind of common villains, as we call them, these explanations for why we are suddenly facing this. And for the three main ones, the first one is journalism, the idea that changes in journalism or the decline of journalistic standards has caused a proliferation of fake or bad news. Others write that it's more fake news that is causing a decline of journalism. I mean, so we find both, but journalism is key in explaining why we're seeing this post-truth crisis in these discourses. Not surprisingly, we find social media as a key villain. And again, the narrative is not just that there's a lot of false information, but that social media is changing people, right? People are becoming trapped in filter bubbles or echo chambers. And I think here it's just on a small side note, it's important to note that empirical research is increasingly challenging this idea of filter bubbles and echo chambers. Like when we look at how people actually get their news, very few people only get one type of news, even conspiracy theorists. So that's kind of on this idea. But again, in this narrative, echo chambers and filter bubbles are key. And that relates to the final villain, the democratic masses themselves, right? The idea that people have changed and no longer understand the complexity of democracy and have become trapped in filter bubbles. So now they can't know what is right and what is wrong. And I mean, if we look at these three, we can quickly see that neither of them are new. Blaming journalism or technology or people for causing a decline of democracy, that has been a staple in political discourse for at least 100 years. I mean, we write in a book that we're reminded of Walter Lippmann, the American intellectual, his writing in the 1920s, where he wrote that society had become too complex for people to understand democracy, and thus we had a real problem on our hands for democracy. But what is new, again, is this notion of post-truth and this idea of something sudden happening. And again, the suddenness is key. This is from one of the popular books, journalistic books on post-truth, where Matthew D'Ancona writes that just as 1968 marked the hippie revolution and the civil rights movement, 2016 was the year that launched the post-truth era. So something sudden has happened. And again, based on all of this, we are not just starting to see a description of the world, we are also starting to see cures, right? I mean, to stay in that vocabulary. We're seeing political leaders, tech companies, all trying to come up with solutions. And one of the key ones, sadly, that we've seen is the rise of censorship laws across the world. We've seen that in Europe, we've seen that in Asia, we've seen that in Africa, we've seen that in South America. So we're pretty much seeing it all over the world. Countries implementing laws to fight fake news that often take the form of these censorship laws, banning certain kind of information or very vaguely describing that people cannot share misinformation. And if we think about it through the lens of post-truth, this makes sense, right? We are facing this sudden crisis and we need to do whatever we can to restore truth in order to save democracy. Then it makes sense, right, to ban what we don't want. But of course, this might not save democracy at all, right? Because as human rights groups have consistently pointed out, these laws are a disaster for freedom of speech, especially in weak democracies where we've seen these being implemented. I mean, we've seen it in Malaysia, Singapore, Honduras, Venezuela, Russia, all implementing fake news laws. Because the question, of course, becomes, as it says here at the bottom, what is fake news and who gets that power to define it, right? And this is where our study points to something which I'm sure you all know, which is that fake news is not at all clear, right? It's one of the most politically contested concepts of our time, and drawing on discourse theory, which we use, that kind of theoretical framework, we call it a floating signifier, which is which describes not only a term that is vague. It's not that fake news is a vague term. It's also that, but it's a floating signifier because if you ask different people, they will have a clear answer, but the answer will be opposite. It will be directly in opposition to the others. So if you ask Donald Trump to ban fake news, and he could do it, I'm sure he would, then I mean, then you know what he would be banning. He would be banning CNN and the New York Times and so forth, right? If you asked another political leader, they would ban something else. And I mean, this elasticity of a term like fake news, which I think is very hard to surpass, that is always a kind of a big risk with this kind of legislation, right? Even if you think now you know what it is, it's very easy for a political leader in the future to come in and start banning critical journalism, start banning political opposition. And that was kind of also what happened when Macron gave his speech. Here's from the Washington Post writing in the headline that Macron said fake news and everyone in Congress heard their own definition. So you could have in the US Republicans and Democrats all nodding and saying, yes, we need to do something about this fake news virus. But of course, they are thinking of very different things, right? And that is a key problem with this idea of solving this through censorship. An example from last year, I wanted to include, which is a quote that very much could be out of our material, but came later. It says, we see misrepresentation of information and we must counter the dissemination of such fake news. And this was said by a representative from the North Korean Central News Agency last year, right? So, I mean, we can see that fake news has taken on this life of its own, where it is very much used as this political signifier in order to delegitimize political opponents, right? And that is a key threat because these solutions that all try to ban fake news when I'm pointing back to, if I point back to what I said in the first half, banning fake news would not have stopped the Internet Research Agency from what they were doing, because they were not spreading fake news. And at the same time, you are actually prohibiting your own citizens from sharing information, which might be false, but I mean, that has always been part of democracy. So, I mean, I think we have a key problem on our hands here with the way this is being thought about. Finally, finally, in what I will talk about here, we have all this idea about techno-solutionism, the idea that technology will solve all of this, right? That we should just leave it to the market. And I mean, of course, social media companies have been key in projecting this narrative. As Jack Dorsey, for example, from Twitter said, if you want to improve something, you have to measure the health of it. Just like a fever, if the human body has a fever, you have to measure it before you know it's a fever. And we have to measure conversation on Twitter in order to improve it. So here we can see that Dorsey is drawing directly on this idea of fake news as a disease to try to think about solutions. But the problem is, of course, we have to ask, what is a healthy conversation? Who gets that power to define that? Is that Jack Dorsey who will get that power? And what will he do about that fever, right? How will he solve it? And obviously, social media companies are very vague deliberately on how they and how much they do about this issue. So this is our argument, that this medical vocabulary actually depoliticizes both problems and solutions. Because when you talk about it as a virus, it becomes something that's not a political issue in the same way. Yes, we need to fight the virus by any means. We need to come up with a vaccine. But of course, if the vaccine is censorship, then we have a problem, right? Because even though you talked about saving democracy, we can all agree, I hope, that limiting people in a country's ability to express themselves is not the best road to go down. It's at least a very fragile road to go down, and one we should be very careful about. And this is also what we've seen during COVID. We've seen that in Hungary, for example, they implemented a law giving up to 5 years of jail time for a journalist spreading fake news. And we've seen that this notion of an infodemic has been used in order to accelerate censorship in many countries. So yeah, I think obviously this is a problem. So just on a final note, I'll just briefly put it into perspective and just answer the question of why do I not think we live in a post-truth era? Because the first question we have to ask is, when was the truth era, right? And obviously we face a problem there because we can quickly agree that there was no truth era. I mean, there was never this time where truth was just everywhere, and especially in a country like the US, where we know the history with segregation and so forth. It's quite hard, and if some will even find it perhaps offensive to say that we should go back to a great era, right? There is an irony here that the notion of post-truth has a bit of the same vibe as Make America Great Again, that we should go back to an era that never existed and where everything was great, right? This implicit idea of a truth. So this is a key reason. But then also, if we look at the voter turnout, for example, that has been declining globally on a much more steady level for many years, and we see no sudden decline. So something else seems to be going on here. We also see trust in US government, and government in the US has been declining for many years now. So again, nothing new or sudden has been going on, but something much more steady. There is a crisis of democracy, but it's not just something that came overnight caused by social media. It's much more about politics itself. And I mean, I will be wrapping up now, but I mean, what we then put into perspective also is just that many political theorists, and we draw on critical theorists like Chantal Mouffe and Rancher, Colin Crouch, they have argued for decades that democracy is facing a crisis, but it's not caused by a decline of truth. It's caused by a decline of political vibrancy, that one party looks too much like the other party, that politics has become too centered on managing the status quo of globalized markets and so forth. That for people voting, the sense of difference between parties has become less. And that is also why we see a rise, they would argue, of these far-right populist parties, that people seek towards something promising to be new and different and radical and so forth. So with all that, it might seem like I'm ending on kind of this very depressing note. I think there is a lot of problems with fake news, and I think there are a lot of problems, there's a lot of problems with disinformation, and then there are all these problems with the way disinformation is being tackled right now. But kind of my whole motivation for writing this book and doing the research is not to say that this is all hopeless and we should give up. I mean, I think this is very much still in process. We are seeing in some countries that implemented censorship laws that they have since been rolled back. We see the EU now talking about regulating social media companies in a much more systemic way, talking about data protection and so forth. So kind of my hope to leave all of this is not to say this is all hopeless, but to say there is a problem with disinformation that needs to be tackled in a much more clever way than it is right now politically. I mean, it should be addressed through legislation. We cannot just believe that these companies are going to do it themselves. And then, on the other hand, we should be very critical about censorship laws and this notion of a virus and this notion that fake news can just be removed from the face of the earth, and then we will all be happy and have a good democracy, right? So I will end it there in order for you guys to just have time to ask one or two questions. So I will stop my share of the screen, and so you guys can see me again. And then you're more than welcome to ask me questions.
Thank you so much, Johan. And as before, please, everyone, write your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A section, and they will be forwarded to us here, and we can ask them to you.
And you're welcome to write in Swedish if that is preferable to you.
While waiting for anyone in the audience having their questions, I'm curious. I mean, we are now in a fact-checking community. In a conference for fact checkers, researchers, scholars, and journalists alike. What would be your best suggestion, since you are very critical of the terms fake news and disinformation, and also in that direction about debunking disinformation, because that could only go in the direction of the people wanting to spread disinformation. So what would be if you had to write a checklist in 3 points, this is how you should do it, what would be on that list?
I mean, I will first off say, I think that a lot of these fact-checking initiatives that have come in recent years, trying to kind of debunk viral stories online, are really doing an important job. I mean, I think there's a lot of important work to be done there. So I'm not saying that this is all kind of useless and you shouldn't do that. I mean, I think my key point is just that a lot of the really well-made and dangerous disinformation, and I do like the term disinformation, I think, to describe this more generally, does not take the form of fake news and is not so easily debunked. That will require political solutions. So, I mean, I think if you ask me for like the 2 or 3 things I think are most important, they are all political solutions. I think we need to push politicians to legislate, for example, that researchers and journalists need to have some kind of access to data on disinformation from these social media platforms. We see Facebook, ironically, has actually become more difficult to study for researchers since 2016. I mean, because they shut down their APIs and all of this, a bit technical, but I mean, there needs to be some kind of way for researchers to get access to data on these issues. I mean, for example, Facebook last year said that they took down 5.4 billion fake accounts in 2019. And I mean, that's a huge number, but it's impossible for anyone to know how many of them targeted Sweden, for example. How many wrote in Swedish? How many wrote about politics? Or how many were just kind of spam accounts? So I mean, that kind of data would be very important to know for Swedish researchers Are we seeing a rise in fake accounts targeting Sweden? Or, I mean, this is completely opaque right now. I think that is important. And I mean, there are a lot of policy solutions like that. We could talk about how we should limit micro-targeting of political ads. And I think there are a lot of important things. We should also talk about perhaps putting a tax on political ads and giving some of that money to fact checkers. Right now, we are all relying on Facebook's pockets to pay for fact-check initiatives in a lot of countries. And I don't think that is viable. We need to implement some sustainable solutions saying, you have run a social media platform that is bigger than so-and-so, you have to comply with some basic regulation about transparency, about contributing to fact-checking.
There's a question asking, can you give us some tips about useful tools to monitor and research social media content?
Yeah, I mean, it's changing all the time, right? I mean, as I said, Facebook has shut down their API. So actually on Facebook, I think increasingly research are turning towards qualitative work, as I've also been doing mainly. I mean, the thing we did with cloaked Facebook pages, I mean, it was just following manually these accounts for a number of months, finding collaborations. I mean, I know in a lot of countries now, there are these Facebook groups, for example, with private people trying to stop fake accounts and trying to find fake news stories and doing this kind of debunking. And I think research and journalists should ally ourselves with these citizens trying to do this kind of work, because again, that makes it so much easier for us to also find these cases before they are gone. I mean, on Twitter, there are a number of applications we can use to collect data through the API. But again, a problem is that if you look at research on social media just generally, but also disinformation specifically, I mean, 80% of all research is on Twitter. And how many citizens are on Twitter? It's not even in the top 5 or 10, right? I mean, on the world stage. So I think there's a big problem that a lot of these big platforms are just really hard to study. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp. And I mean, we need to be creative. And I think often, if we can't get the big data, we should try to get the thick data, as we say, right? And try to go deep and do it manually. Try to engage with communities, find sources that can help us, this kind of thing.
Thank you so much. And we just ran out of time there. So we'll say thanks a lot. And I'm sure there might be some more conversation going on in the chat or afterwards.